Abandoned by Disney is a story that has always haunted me. I was exposed to it at an extremely young age back when internet horror was becoming a more popular genre, and being a child that grew up with a strong love for Mickey Mouse and any media associated with him, it was essentially a recipe for disaster. I distinctly remember the week after I learned about that original story. I couldn't look at anything that had the character's face on it because I was just reminded of those visceral descriptions of gore and surreal horror. But oddly enough, despite the fact that it scared me so badly, I kept finding myself drawn back to it. Call it morbid curiosity or the early stages of what would be my horror obsession I have nowadays, but whatever it was, I couldn't get this story off my mind. I would listen to different narrations of it, explore fan art and other fan works like the Treasure Island series, and every time they would terrify me, but I always found myself going back for more. And that leads me to this video. To this day, I find myself drawn to this story, to the twisted version of an old beloved character that it created, to the commentary on Disney as a whole and the corruption scene behind closed doors. As an adult, I find myself even more fascinated by this story because now I can understand all the elements at play that make it one of, if not the scariest creepypasta I have ever read. It is a genuinely well-crafted experience that achieves what it sets out to do perfectly, and I'd like to show you why. In this video, I want to explore this classic story, analyzing the tactics it uses to scare the reader and discussing how it uses them very effectively. And I feel to best explain this, we should use the story's most iconic scene as our prime example. That scene being the moment where our protagonist comes face to face with an inverted Mickey Mouse costume. Now, before I can explore this scene in length, I feel like I should very briefly provide some context as to the events leading to it for those of you who either aren't familiar with the story or simply need a refresher. Abandoned by Disney is a story about our blog writer and protagonist exploring an abandoned Disney resort known as Mowgli's Palace. Not much was known about why the place was abandoned, but the only evidence the writer could scrounge up being the massive controversy surrounding it upon its opening. But that alone didn't seem to make sense. The place still made money for a time like any other Disney resort, but then it just abruptly closed and everyone seemingly forgot about it. As the writer makes his way through the abandoned resort though, bizarre occurrences begin to show themselves which slowly reveal the reasoning behind this abandonment. Meat hooks in a freezer seemingly swinging on their own, whispering voices being heard in empty rooms. And of course, the climax of the story, his eventual encounter with a photo-negative Mickey costume. The scene goes as follows. I reached for the headpiece of a Donald Duck costume and carefully removed it so the thing wouldn't fall apart in my hands. As I looked into the face of the wide-eyed, moldering head, a loud clattering sound made me jump with fright. I looked down at my feet and there between my shoes was a human skull. It had fallen out of the mascot head and shattered into pieces at my feet. Only the empty face and lower jaw remained staring up at me. I dropped the duck head immediately, as you'd expect, and moved for the door. As I stood in the doorway, I looked back to the skull on the floor. I had to take a picture of it, you know? I had to, for any number of reasons that may seem silly, but only if you don't think it through. I'd need proof of what happened, especially if Disney was going to somehow make this go away. I had no doubt in my mind right from the start that even if it was just gross negligence, Disney was responsible for this. That's when Mickey, the photo-negative, opposite Mickey in the middle of the floor, started to get up. First sitting up, then climbing to its feet, the Mickey Mouse costume, or whoever was inside of it, stood there at the center of the room. Its fake face just staring directly at me as I mumbled no over and over and over. With shaking hands, a violently thrashing heart, and legs that had once again turned to jelly, I managed to lift the camera and aim it at the opposite creature now quietly sizing me up. The digital camera screen displayed only dead pixels in the shape of the thing. It was a perfect silhouette of the Mickey costume. As the camera moved in my unsteady hands, the dead pixels spread, marring the screen wherever Mickey's outline moved to. Then the camera died, went blank and quiet and broken. I raised my eyes once again to the Mickey Mouse costume. it said in a hushed, perverted, but perfectly executed Mickey Mouse voice.
"Wanna see my head come off?"
It started to pull at its own head, working its clumsy, glove-clad fingers around its neck with clawing, impatient movements similar to a wounded animal trying to pull himself free from a predator's jaws. As it worked its digits around its neck, so much blood, so much thick, chunky, yellow blood. I turned away as I heard a sickening tearing of cloth and flesh. Only cared about getting away. Above the doorway out of this room, I saw the final message clawed into the metal with bone or fingernails. Abandoned by God. Now I feel like it goes without saying why a much younger version of myself would have been absolutely traumatized by this moment. But why do I find it scary nowadays? Well, there is the obvious answer of the scene's more overt horror, what with the graphic depictions of self-mutilation and the implications of human corpses inside the costumes, but I feel like the real horror of this moment is found in its more subtle details. Take, for example, the description of the Mickey costume itself. I feel like if the scene were done with a regular mascot costume, sure, it would still be effective to a degree, but a large part of the horror would be lost. Making this suit a regular costume would allow the reader to at least partially understand what it is they're looking at. After all, this moment takes place in a room full of suits which are implied to have bodies stored away inside of them. It would be so easy to simply see the living suit as some kind of reanimated corpse given new life. Something which could be scary, yes, but wouldn't be as striking as what we get in the actual story. By making the suit an inverted color palette, it immediately stands out. It doesn't fit in with anything else in the room, it feels alien. Something that could have easily been explained with the prior context the story establishes is now a complete mystery. And that unknown factor is what makes this thing so horrifying before it even does anything. And then there's the iconic moment where it removes its own head. This moment always stood out to me so much because of how the act of self-mutilation this thing commits is described. Rather than pulling off its head like a mascot entertainer would, it's described clawing at its own throat like a wounded man. It struggles to tear any flesh or fabric as a result of its large, clumsy gloves, making this moment seem slow and excruciating. And then there's the blood. When I first read this story years ago, it was the description of the blood which stood out to me the most. Yellow, chunky blood. I feel like upon hearing this description, most people who first read this story assume that it's describing photonegative blood. I mean, everything about this costume is inverted, so it would only make sense that the blood would be as well. But the thing is, that isn't the case. The color red when put through a negative filter turns blue. You can see just as much when looking at Mickey's pants, which have turned to a bright turquoise color. So what the hell is pouring out of this thing's throat? Because whatever it isn't blood. And to add even further onto that, there's the fact that it's described as being chunky, as if the liquid gushing from this thing's open wound is thick or curdled in some way. Everything about this moment and this costume feels so viscerally wrong. The way it looks, the way it behaves, the environment it finds itself in. All of it feels so familiar, and yet the differences at play make it go from something innocent and comforting like the brand it represents, to something so extremely haunting. And then there's that last message right at the end which acts as the cherry on top to this moment. Abandoned by God. This line in particular stuck with me for so long, perfectly encapsulating just how wrong everything about it feels. And that perfectly summarizes why I feel Abandoned by Disney is one of, if not the scariest creepypasta ever made. The entire story is veiled in mystery, using real and recognizable characters and events to establish itself and twisting them to the point that they're nearly unrecognizable. It horrified me as a kid for that, but I also feel like that's why I kept going back to it. That mystery enthralled me. I wanted to understand it. I wanted to know what it all meant, why this costume existed, what it wanted, why its blood was such a vile color and texture. But as hard as I looked, I could never find an answer. leading to this story being an unsolved mystery. Or at least that's what I thought. Now by this point, you're probably confused. It seems like the entire subject of the video has passed, and yet we're only just at the start. And you see, there's a very good reason for this. At first, this video was intended to simply be an analysis of the original Abandoned by Disney story. But as I did my research for it, I found myself slowly becoming invested in the other works created by Slimebeast, the original story's author. There are 3 other stories, all of which are canon to the events and universe of Abandoned by Disney, and these stories add so much new context and horror to that original story that I just wanted to talk about them so badly. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. During this section of the video, I plan on going in depth on the other 3 creepypastas which make up the Abandoned by Disney mythos, going over what they add to the story, what I like about them, and eventually using the information provided by all of them to create my own theory about the identity of photo-negative Mickey. So, I hope you're strapped in, because we're only just getting started. The first of these additional stories I want to talk about is A Few Suggestions. I bring this one up first because unlike the other 2 that follow it, this story is actually a prequel to the original Abandoned by Disney, which gives us a glimpse at what Mowgli's palace was like before its abandonment. And I must say that other than the original story it was based on, this particular creepypasta is easily my favorite, both for what it establishes, as well as how insanely creative it is. A Few Suggestions isn't structured like your typical creepypasta story. Rather than being a third-person account of some horrific event or a blog post, this story takes the form of a suggestion board that existed when Mowgli's palace was still active. We are essentially reading over all of the staff's different suggestion cards for the resort, getting small glimpses into the inner workings of the attraction, while also piecing together multiple ongoing narratives. Throughout the story, we jump perspective a lot. There are a few cards which are completely one-off, but for the most part we actually see several staff members time and time again updating the reader about whatever issues they're dealing with at the resort. There are some more tame suggestion cards that are ongoing like you would expect, a staff member complaining about the vending machines, someone being bothered by the music at one of the attractions, someone complaining about vandalism and the park's need for better security measures. However, as the story goes, we begin seeing cards from staff members who are experiencing a bit more of a twisted narrative. The first of these more notable cards comes from someone who is extremely upset over a man named Frank who keeps cheating at solitaire. At first this just seems like some kind of joke card, until later on where he starts going into detail about how he intends on murdering Frank by drowning him in one of the resort's toilets. The second, and even more off-putting of these notable cards, is a staff member who keeps complaining about faceless children being admitted into the resort. As his story goes on, he complains about the fact that he has to kill them, with the other children becoming angrier and harder to control when he does so. And just when you thought those 2 were as strange as the story would get, we start seeing suggestion cards being written by a mysterious staff member whose dialogue goes as follows.
Costumes sticking to the sores. It's too hard to write with these gloves on. I'm a mouse. I keep sinking into the floor. Or maybe it's just that I feel like it. I can't get my head off, 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 I can't get my head off. Ignore last card. It was my real head. I forgot. The costume is sticking to my sores. And there are more sores. All I am is sores. The costume is breathing. And if I don't match its movements, I can't get any air. Please. Help. The costumes are heavy with people inside, and there's no hook left for me.
It would seem as though our good friend Photonegative Mickey got his hands on the suggestion cards, and as well as having extremely disturbing dialogue, he's also begun messing with people at the park. We see multiple employees complaining about suggestion cards being stolen only to turn up with nonsense being written on all of them. The person complaining about the music brings up how it's begun distorting and playing backwards. And at the very end of the story, we see the staff member who is complaining about security bring up how there appears to be more mascots at the park than they have on their payroll. At some point, this inverted mascot just appeared at the park and began causing disturbances, until eventually we reach its final line of dialogue, which reveals that it has begun murdering other entertainers and hanging their corpses in the mascot's only room. I love this story both for the way it conveys its horror as well as it giving us some legitimate context as to the events which transpired before the park's abandonment. Reading the messages from Photonegative Mickey, seeing how a staff member suffered as they slowly became one with a costume they can't escape from is a genuinely terrifying image. And some of the more specific lines in that sequence really stuck with me for a while, like the story going into detail about how the supposed entertainer trapped in the costume had to sync their breathing with it to avoid being completely suffocated. It makes this thing's very existence seem miserable, adding further to the moment in the original story where it commits a violent act of self-mutilation. There is now proper characterization at play with this monster, and rather than detracting from the mystery of that original story, it instead adds on to it, making Photonegative Mickey feel more out of place than it ever was before based purely on its behavior and very existence. This story shows when it showed up and gave us little tidbits about what it's going through, but it leaves so much unanswered still. We don't know where it came from, what it wants, why it begins killing its fellow staff. We're given a small piece of a much bigger puzzle here, and those other pieces can quickly be found when exploring the next two stories that make up the larger universe. So let's go take a look at those next. Out of all the sequel stories I have talked about and will talk about in this video, I feel like Room Zero is without a doubt the most well-known and popular one, and I feel like that is for a very good reason. As well as being a good follow-up to the original Abandoned by Disney story, Room Zero is just a very well-crafted creepypasta on its own, stringing together a new and unique narrative which very effectively plays into what we can now see is the series' main overarching theme of corruption within corporations like Disney that are so big they continue to get away with it. Sure, Room Zero has supernatural elements at play, but I feel like what makes this story so disturbing to me is all the stuff that happens independently of that. Stories about horribly treated workers living through traumatic situations because it was their job, people being stalked for finding out too much about Disney's shady background, secret locations which have been sealed away like we saw at Mowgli's palace. All of these elements make this story so much more immersive, feeling like they really could have happened alongside all the supernatural horror it also delves into. Actually, looking at the story itself, Room Zero is a direct continuation of Abandoned by Disney, presumably taking place either months or years after the original story was posted. Our blog writer since then has become paranoid, both because of what he witnessed at Mowgli's palace, but also because it appears as though he's being stalked. He notices people off the corner of his eye watching him. He sees suspicious characters asking him oddly specific questions when he leaves his house. And perhaps the most obvious sign that he's being watched happens when he sees a chalk drawing next to his car depicting what he can assume is Photonegative Mickey with writing beneath it reading, "Retract." These signs of him being stalked, as well as his desire to expose Disney's wrongdoings, has led our writer down a rabbit hole, getting in contact with multiple anonymous Disney staff and researchers to try and dig up as much dirt on the company as possible. And that's what takes up the entirety of the story, accounts from several different characters explaining their own morbid experiences working for and/or investigating Disney. Our first new character is a man who simply goes by the name Researcher. who is obsessed with hunting for a group of mysterious Disney guests he refers to as gascots. These bizarre customers are described as being people who move like wounded animals and are often spotted at Disney resorts wearing Mickey Mouse themed gas masks with so much condensation around their eyes they wouldn't be able to see. Multiple characters have their own accounts of these strange people being spotted around Disney resorts, with them never seemingly posing a threat. And if you thought they were weird, the gascots are only the beginning of the bizarre accounts given by the people in this story. Our second new character is one who goes by the name Lifeguard, who describes his own unsettling experiences when working at one of Disney's water parks. He talks about an experience where a child went down one of the slides and seemingly vanished without a trace, only to come out the other end moments later appearing pale and sickly. All the kid could talk about afterwards was his encounter with a group of faceless children, the same faceless children we had described to us in a few suggestions. This phenomena apparently continued afterwards as well, with children coming out of the slide in the wrong order and many children coming out seemingly shocked by whatever it was they saw. When the writer asked for Lifeguard to give more details, he refused, leaving it a complete mystery. The next and most disturbing of these accounts to me comes from a mascot performer who goes by the name Snow White. She describes not a supernatural experience at one of the parks, but rather a mandate that all mascot entertainers had to follow. That being a rule regarding any of the mascots dying while in costume. Say for example, someone in costume suddenly suffers a fatal stroke while out taking photos. Disney would force another entertainer to go where it happened and sit there with the body, continuing to take photos until someone arrived to dispose of it. This particular part of the story got to me a lot, because it was the only account that wasn't based on anything supernatural, but rather a legitimately traumatizing experience brought about for the sake of not ruining the magic of Disney World. Just imagine being in the position of both parties involved here, either being an entertainer forced to sit next to a corpse of a colleague while trying to keep your composure, or being a customer seemingly taking a photo with Mickey Mouse only to find out later it was a dead body. Regardless of whose perspective you have in this part of the story, it is bone-chilling, and I absolutely adore this moment for that exact reason. The next and final accounts come from a pair of people called Janitor and Hammer, who give their accounts discussing their work both cleaning for and building multiple locations at several Disney resorts. They bring up places like Club 22, a hidden location built explicitly for the purpose of illegal and adult activities at their parks. They talk about the utility tunnels, which were built under the parks for workers to travel between. And eventually, Hammer discusses a bizarre room he finds, which was sealed over completely in concrete. At first, he isn't told much about it, but upon doing some investigating, he's able to get in contact with an old woman named Ida who tells him what the room originally was. The room was a bomb shelter called Room Zero. It was designed in a time where tensions were high and the risk of domestic attacks were very likely, and Disney didn't want to take any chances. Alongside the room, they provided customers with Mickey Mouse-themed gas masks for protection and to stop any children from being afraid in the event of an attack taking place. The room went unused for a long time, until one day an alarm was set off by someone or something. Hundreds of people piled down into Room Zero, wearing their mascot-themed gas masks and waiting for something, anything to happen. At first it was quiet, but then the first signs of mass hysteria set in. One man cried out that someone was pinching him, and soon after the room devolved into chaos. People arguing and fighting one another, all the while cramped in an empty concrete room. And then the lights went out. And with that, the chaos reached its climax, everyone inside the small bomb shelter screaming out in a cacophony of panic and violence, with only a select few Disney staff managing to escape the chaos. And what they found when they finally left Room Zero wasn't a destroyed park or an ongoing attack. Instead, everything was perfectly intact. There was never an attack to begin with. Meanwhile, down in the bomb shelter, the chaos continued, with the panic only seeming to get worse until suddenly, everything stopped. The room fell silent, deafeningly silent. Ida, who was one of the staff that escaped the bomb shelter, went down to see what happened, and upon opening the door, she was met with a dark, empty room. At first, it had seemed like everyone vanished without a trace, but then a voice rang out. A voice which echoed out in such a way where it was impossible to tell whether it came from deep within the room or right in front of her face. The voice, hushed and raspy, simply said,
"Shut the door, dear. You're letting out the cold."
Now, I don't want to sound like a broken record when I say this, but this moment is one of the most chilling things I've ever read. Not quite to the degree of the original story, but it certainly competes with it. There's just so much going on that there are proper layers to the horror here. The mystery of who or what set off the alarm, the mass hysteria that devolved into chaos only to suddenly stop as everyone disappeared without a trace, the supposed origin of our Gascots brought up earlier in the story, and of course the mysterious voice at the end. There's just so much that happens within the span of this very short section that I feel like it could deserve an entire video on its own. And after this moment ends, we're only left with more questions. Ida explains that they sealed up Room Zero after the fact, acting like the entire thing never happened, much like what happened with Mowgli's palace. And after her part of the story is done, Room Zero comes to an end as it's explained that Ida died shortly after giving her account, with her body being found in her home, which was described as being covered in Mickey Mouse silhouettes. A haunting ending to a haunting story. Like I said at the start of this creepypasta, I feel like Room Zero stands out a lot both for its use of supernatural elements we've come to expect, but also because of its more realistic depictions of corruption within Disney. For every bizarre, unexplainable experience someone has, there's something more grounded in reality which accompanies it. Mascot entertainers dying on sight, Club 22, our protagonist literally being stalked. Room Zero, despite it dealing with such an otherworldly event near the end, feels the most grounded in reality, and for that reason, I find it very uniquely scary compared to all the other stories it was made alongside. I also find myself enjoying the story a lot purely for the world building it provides to the universe of Abandoned by Disney. It chooses to stray away from what we know, giving us glimpses at other bizarre entities and events that happened in-universe, showing us that photonegative Mickey isn't the only active threat in this world. It builds even further upon the mystery that we've been following up to this point, making it all the more satisfying when all our questions are eventually answered. And speaking of that, I think it's finally time that we discuss the last and easily most important entry in the entire Abandoned by Disney series, Corruptus. So let's do that next. And so we arrive at the final story in this surprisingly lengthy series of creepypastas, Corruptus. As I said before, this is without a doubt the most important story we'll be talking about today. While the others exist to build up the world of Abandoned by Disney and establish its main overarching themes and mystery, Corruptus exists to finally give us the answers that we've been seeking since the start. And this much is apparent from the very first sentence we read in the story. If you really believe in something, it can be yours. A statement which at first seems like a small motivational quote that you will soon realize symbolizes the entirety of Abandoned by Disney once we finish this final entry. Corruptus begins in a similar manner to that of Room Zero, with our blog writer giving us another update as to what has happened to him since his previous post. Since that previous story had gone up, his stalking situation had only gotten worse. Groups of bizarre characters in suits had begun following him, writing down notes on clipboards that were nothing but nonsense. He believes these people to have been sent after him for the purpose of spiking his paranoia, hopefully scaring him enough to finally drop his investigation and leave everything from the previous stories behind. Of course, he doesn't fall for this trap, continuing his research and trying to get into contact with whoever he could to expose more of Disney's wrongdoings. And it's during this research that he uncovered an email that led to the creation of the blog post this story is centered around. An email simply titled Corruptus. Now, when this email was first uncovered, whoever wrote it swiftly tried to take it back, with both it and our author's account being deleted. But he was able to open it moments before that happened and managed to download a file that was attached to it. A file which contained a text document that seemingly explains what a Corruptus is. At first, the story leaves it very vague, with us being given a list of different characters we've seen throughout the stories, now each being labeled as a Corruptus. We hear mention of the Gascots from Room Zero, the faceless children mentioned in multiple stories, several Corruptus we've never heard of, and of course, our one and only photo-negative Mickey. After thoroughly going through the list of known Corruptus and their current statuses, our writer finally puts 2 and 2 together and is able to figure out just what has been going on in all of the stories leading up to this point. A Corruptus is a manifestation of a group of people's collective belief in something. Beings born from the minds of humans, complete with all their flaws and all their blemishes. Disney had become so big, so iconic, that their brand and characters became known to millions across the world. And this iconography gave way to these Corruptus being born. Manifestations of a large population's belief in these characters. But because of the flaws seen within these characters and ideas to the people who believe in them, the Corruptus came out flawed. They represent these ideas, but they're twisted versions of them, and that's what makes Disney afraid of them. The author even goes as far as saying that Disney was aware of these beings and even wanted to create them to bring life to their characters, with lines like, "Clap your hands and believe hard enough, and Tinkerbell will live. When you wish upon a star, anything your heart desires," being used to show their true intention. But as Disney tried creating these entities, more and more failures began appearing. These failures were dubbed as Corruptus, and anytime one appeared, it was either terminated or the location it appeared at was abandoned. The story ends with our writer stating that he now understands why Disney has been trying so desperately to silence his research. They're afraid of the knowledge of Corruptus spreading, of people knowing what they've done and what these things are capable of. And with that, the story of Abandoned by Disney truly comes to a close, with the future of our writer being left ambiguous and the knowledge he's gained now being left for all to see and learn. As I said before, this story tells us everything we need to know to understand the many supernatural occurrences within these stories, as well as the identity of many of its monsters. Each of the Corruptus that we see in these stories now has some kind of traceable origin to them, which is reflected by the stories themselves. The mass hysteria seen in Room Zero happens as a result of the collective dread over an attack which never happens. The Gascots appear as a result of the Room Zero incident, with them sprouting up more and more as people begin looking for them due to the now collective belief that they do in fact exist. And of course, this explanation also tells us the origin of our photo-negative Mickey, being a Corruptus which appeared at Mowgli's palace. Now, with all that in mind, you must be wondering what there is to theorize about. Corruptus gave us a pretty straightforward answer as to the origins and identities of these creatures, so there wouldn't really be much to try and theorize about in regards to photo-negative Mickey, right? Well, here's where that comes into play. Corruptus explains what these creatures are and gives us an idea of why they appear, but the nature of photo-negative Mickey and what it represents is still partially left up to the reader to decide. We know that he is a Corruptus, but what he is supposed to be a Corruptus of is partially left up in the air. And that is what I intend on discussing in this final section of the video. Now that we've gone over all the stories within the Abandoned by Disney universe, I'd like to now take a look at all the information they provided us and use it to create a theory as to what photo-negative Mickey is supposed to be. We'll work our way through the stories backwards as I feel we get more definitive information in all the later entries in the series, and we'll see how each of these creepypastas provides evidence to support what I believe is really going on here. So what is my theory? What do I believe to be the identity of photo-negative Mickey? Well, it is my personal belief that this bizarre entity is meant to be a physical manifestation of what I'll be calling the dark side of Disney. Every little flaw, every blemish, every sign of corruption and trauma brought about by Disney is manifested in the Abandoned by Disney universe as an inverted Mickey Mouse costume. Now allow me to explain. Looking closer at Corruptus as a story, we can immediately see signs of this being the case with the very few pieces of dialogue our author has regarding Mowgli's palace and the photonegative Mickey costume. When he begins theorizing about how multiple Corruptus came to be, in regards to this character, he states, "Did everyone in Emerald Isle harbor such a negative impression of Mowgli's palace?" And as well as this, later on, he further elaborates, saying, "How many children have been disappointed, confused, or scarred for life when they saw Mickey without his head?" Both of these excerpts are stated as his way of rationalizing what it was he saw when he went to Mowgli's palace, and right away they both give us a lot of info which immediately supports my theory. When we originally heard about Mowgli's palace at the beginning of the original story, we're told a lot about the sheer amount of controversy which surrounded the resort. It was hated both for its racist depictions of Native Americans at the time, as well as the amount of people who were evicted and had their homes razed to make the park. It would only make sense that this would create a large enough amount of hatred within the population of that area, which would lead to the creation of one such Corruptus. And then there's that other line discussing the idea of the trauma a young child would experience upon watching a beloved cartoon character's head come off only to reveal it was an actor underneath. When reading the original story, the moment where photonegative Mickey pulls off his head always felt jarring due to the nature of what he was doing. It was seen as a violent act of self-mutilation that didn't have much meaning behind it. But now that we have the context provided by Corruptus, this moment is given a whole new meaning. We're not witnessing a horror sequence put together purely to shock the reader. We're seeing a twisted interpretation of the trauma a child experiences on the off chance that a mascot's head falls off, ruining the magic of Disney World for them. One could even say that the brutality of the scene itself is meant to show what that kind of situation feels like in the mind of a child who doesn't know any better, seeing the head of a very real cartoon character get torn off rather than it simply being a costume losing its mask. Now, these two pieces of evidence are probably the most obvious tidbits that support my theory out of everything I'll be discussing here. It feels like they were deliberately chosen to put the idea of what I'm saying into the reader's mind, with everything else in the stories prior being left up to interpretation. And speaking of prior stories, moving along to Room Zero, there isn't as much in it that feels as direct as Corruptus was, but I definitely feel like there are a few moments here which contribute to my theory. For the most part, Room Zero is very disconnected from the events that happened at Mowgli's palace, with it having a stronger focus on Disney's corruption as a whole, as well as the other Corruptus that appear in the series. However, I do feel like there is one specific portion of this story which almost perfectly parallels things we've seen both from Abandoned by Disney, as well as a few suggestions. And that is the moment where we have it described to us what mascot entertainers are forced to do in the event that someone dies in costume. This moment stood out to me a lot, because it was one of the only moments in the entire story where we plainly saw Disney's corruption and poor treatment of its staff shown to us with nothing supernatural involved. And when we look at this moment closer, we start to see a lot of similarities to both it and what we see from photonegative Mickey's behavior. In Room Zero, it is explicitly stated that if someone had experienced a fatal stroke or a heart attack, any actors who were present when this happened were forced to sit alongside the body, taking photos with it and acting like everything is okay. Now compare that to what we see photonegative Mickey doing in a few suggestions. At the end of the story, we see it explicitly state through one of these suggestion cards,
Costumes are heavy with people inside, and there's no hook left for me.
Which implies that it had begun killing entertainers while they were still in costume, hanging their corpses on hooks. I feel this set of events in parallel with Room Zero can very well be seen as a reflection of the kind of trauma an actor would experience being in that kind of situation. And even if they haven't gone through it themselves, the fear that they may have to at some point. After all, Corruptus states that elements of this thing's behavior did come from trauma related to Disney. Children seeing Mickey's head come off, people losing their homes. These are elements which we know for a fact are reflected by photonegative Mickey's behavior. So it is very possible that the similarities between its behavior in a few suggestions and Room Zero's mascot mandates are not a coincidence. Hell, if you wanted to explore these similarities even further, we can also look at the fact that when photonegative Mickey is first encountered by our author in the original story, it is described as, quote, lying on its back in the center of the floor like a murder victim. The fur on the costume was rotting and shedding, creating bare patches. Anytime photonegative Mickey is described in its original encounter, the author always made a point of making it sound like a reanimated corpse, even further adding on to the idea that it is meant to be a reflection of many mascot entertainers' trauma when they are either told about or are forced to act upon the inhumane mandates that are forced upon them. And we can see even more ideas like this at play when we look at a few suggestions. Now with this story, I imagine you must be confused. Earlier on in the video, I talk about photonegative Mickey's role in the story as being a mascot entertainer who gets trapped in his own costume. And while I feel like this is what many people assume is going on when they initially read this story, the context given by Corruptus and my theory completely change the way we view it. Photonegative Mickey isn't an entertainer who was driven mad when it was trapped inside of its own costume. It is a living suit that believes itself to be human, or at least it did for a time. That is why it's shown desperately trying to escape its own costume only to have it sticking to its skin. That's why when it tries to remove its own head at first, it comes to the realization that it was never trying to remove a mask, but rather its own real head. And that is why at the end of the story, we hear one of the staff members say, "As far as I can tell, there are more mascots on the grounds than we have on payroll. Security says it doesn't make sense, but I think we have one extra." As we read in a few suggestions, we are quite literally seeing this new Corruptus being born and coming to grips with the fact that it is not human. It tries to escape its own skin at first, but realizes that it can't. And once it realizes this, realizes that it is just a costume, it begins killing other staff members and hanging them up because it starts viewing its fellow mascots like itself. And as well as this, there's also something else this story explains, but not in the way that I've seen many people say it does. That being the yellow blood. See, earlier in the story, there is a suggestion card from one of Mowgli's palace's employees which says, "Please give the mascots more break time or allow them to take short breathers during work hours. Sweat and body odor are one thing, but now we keep getting the same suit full of vomit." A lot of people point to this line of dialogue as being the explanation for what the yellow blood is, stating that the costume is photonegative Mickey and the vomit is what the blood actually is. And while I do feel this moment is supposed to give us an idea of what the yellow blood is, I don't think it's as literal as many people have been led to believe. If this suit actually were photonegative Mickey, not only would that not make sense since we know later on in the story that the suit is either alive or it's stuck to its wearer, but I feel like the person who wrote that suggestion card would take note of the fact that the suit is the wrong colors. What feels more likely to me is that the yellow blood isn't actually the vomit from that suit, but is instead a reflection of the staff's experience being forced to deal with such harsh working conditions. If it's such a recurring event that the staff are given such little break time that someone has been actively throwing up inside their costume, I feel like that alone would be both a horrible experience for the person experiencing it, as well as the person who is forced to clean it at the end of every shift. Considering this happened at Mowgli's palace and this card was written before we see photonegative Mickey appear, it could very well be possible that the collective suffering brought about by such a vile experience could be reflected by the suit's blood sharing a similar appearance to puke. After all, the blood is described as having a gross yellow coloration and being chunky, something that much better fits the description of vomit rather than blood. And considering the fact that we see other elements of these entertainers' stress and trauma reflected by photonegative Mickey, makes it all the more likely that this is what the story is trying to tell us. And finally, Moving on to the original story, we have more general elements of the series and photonegative Mickey as a character that I feel supports my theory to end things off. The first, and overall most obvious clue about this thing being a reflection of the dark side of Disney, is the actual design of the suit itself. Right from the get-go, our author makes a point of telling us that this suit looks wrong. Its entire color palette is completely inverted, making this thing look like it's meant to be the opposite of Mickey Mouse, the opposite of what Disney wants us to see this character as. And this extends to its mannerisms. Rather than being on a hook like the other suits, it lies on the ground like a corpse. Rather than removing its head like a mask, it claws at it as if the very fabric of its suit is flesh. Everything about this suit is purposely designed to feel wrong. Like it is everything Mickey Mouse, and by extension Disney, shouldn't be. The second of these more general elements that I feel support my theory is simply seen from the overall theme of the story here and how this particular character reflects it. The entirety of these 4 creepypastas are all themed around the idea of corruption within massive corporations like Disney. Every single one of them has elements sprinkled in to allude to that. Mowgli's palace and his mistreatment of staff, as well as its racist depictions of native people, the entirety of Room Zero and all the stories from anonymous sources, Corruptus and Disney's obsession with creating a false god of their own characters. In all of these stories, this theme is present, and considering the fact that a lot of these elements are seen in photonegative Mickey, and the fact that it's the face of these stories, it would only make sense that it exists to represent Disney's corruption as a single character. And adding even further onto that, it would also explain that final line of dialogue which was read at the end of the original story, abandoned by God. In Corruptus, our protagonist explains that he feels God had abandoned humanity out of fear of them creating false gods through their collective worship. And right at the end of that first story, after meeting the character that I feel represents everything wrong with Disney, that single line appears which confirms our author's suspicions. Every detail at play in these stories points back to this single entity. This Corruptus, which exists purely as a stain on Disney's image, the culmination of all their corruption, all their flaws, every wrongdoing they've ever committed, and it wears the face of their most beloved character and mascot. That is my theory, and that is the end of this discussion about my favorite set of creepypastas ever made. If you agree with this theory, then that is wonderful, as putting it together was an insane amount of fun on my end. And if not, then that's even better. I've said in the past that I'm always one who loves discussion about media I enjoy, so if you disagree with me or have your own theory, please let me know in the comments so I can see some other unique perspectives about these stories. I love Abandoned by Disney to death, and being able to talk about it at such length, talking about its horror, its storytelling, and everything else surrounding it has been such a ridiculous amount of fun for me. If you made it this far into the video, thank you. It means a lot to see that you stuck around through this massive video and made it to the end. This was easily the most work I have ever put into one of these uploads, so it means a lot this time around to see that you stuck through to the very end of it. Anyways though, with all that said, that'll be all from me for now. I hope you all enjoyed watching this video even half as much as I enjoyed making it. I hope to see you here again for whatever my next project ends up being. Goodbye for now.